any of the speakers.
Just raise one. I wondered if there was any connection at all. I mean, it does seem different between the figure of the sea child and the Mami water figure that comes into Nigerian and Ghanaian literature so much.
It's definitely we get the whole kind of mythology of the woman who undergoes this kind of magical transformation. That's exactly what she's thinking of. Yeah. So it's hard because it would take me quite a long time to explain the dense networking of kind of cultural references that Hopkinson evokes. But yeah, she's definitely thinking of it.
Okay, thanks.
Kate, I wouldn't want to kind of, because I haven't got text here, and I haven't read Naipaul for quite a while. I wouldn't want to sort of launch into a great sort of diatribe of anti-Naipaul. I do appreciate a lot of earlier Naipaul, but I was struck by you saying, that at times there is this authorial relish, is your phrase, and the revulsion shared by the writer. And often that is my my sort of little quarrel maybe with Naipaul in some of these texts, the one Alison alluded to in Way in the World, and both these books that you mainly deal with in A Free State. And it's it's a kind of, I don't know what you call it, a kind of a slippage, it seems to be, in Naipaul, if that's the right word. It's a very trendy word for me to use, I'm not sure I know what it means. It's like, he does it with the politics in that same way in the world with Lebrun, who is the kind of political figure, but is actually V.S. Naipaul, and it's a kind of way of actually demeaning a lot of left politics. And I feel that this happens a lot with the sexuality in A Free State. Why this figure? Why has he chosen a gay man to deal with this? And why is he really attracted to gorillas? The historical story that gorillas is actually based on. And what is this giving us here in this kind of conference, about what we want to really be saying about sexuality and gay sexuality? I just don't want to redeem Mr. Naipaul as a spokesperson for And my quarrel with Alison, in A Way in the World, anybody who knows that story, the opening story in A Way in the World, I think Alison's absolutely right in a literary critical sense, that there are these two narrators, and Naipaul does make that. But the thing is, for me, and this is part of the kind of slippage thing, is that the voice of the school teacher in that piece and the voice of the author is not sufficiently different for us not to feel that Naipaul is being a little naughty in allowing the school teacher to sort of vent what she does. And that seems to be always the case. And that's my quarrel, I suppose. But I don't know, did you find it a lot, these authorial relishes, and I love that phrase, I'm going to hold on to it, and revulsion shared by the writer?
I absolutely agree with you on the slippages, if we're going to use that term. And right across Naipaul's work, I really struggled with where to situate the author's views and in relation to the views he's proclaiming or his characters. I think in A Free State, I found that revulsion more about Bobby. What interests me about gorillas is I felt that there was more of that relish in the writing of Jane's suffering and far less of it, minimally, in his writing of Bryant. And that's what I find so interesting. That relish I find problematic to me in this particular novel isn't there to the same extent. Bryant isn't dismissed and others, and there isn't that slippage in quite the same way. Where that leaves us in terms of why Naipaul is using a gay man, I'm not sure, and I'd be really interested in knowing what other people think. I think in A Free State, it's more clear to me what he's trying to do with using a gay figure in terms of talking about colonialism. He seems to be trying here to use a gay figure to show the failings of black nationalist rhetoric. But something goes wrong in that. I don't think that's what the figure ends up doing, and I'm not sure what Naipaul's intentionality is with that. In terms of where it leaves us as a conference, in terms of the view of Naipaul, I mean, I'm certainly not trying to rescue Naipaul as some kind of icon of same-sex writing that's been neglected. Well, the reason I use him in my book is to show that even some of the figures who are most problematic aren't as straightforwardly homophobic or as straightforwardly celebrating heteronormativity in the way that is sometimes talked about. I don't know if that kind of answers the questions.
Yeah, that's a good discussion. Yeah.
I think what I'd say is what's absolutely fascinating for me is that is the inability not to allow those two to leak into each other. They absolutely shouldn't. You know, and I agree with you that those two voices are a narrative device, and that you know we're his kind of rapport with that figure and his revulsion towards that figure completely coexist, and that's what I find so fascinating. That even in spite of this desire to set distance, proximity keeps interrupting that, and I think that that's what's quite interesting as well in Gorillas and in Enigma of Arrival as well. That actually his, you know, the kind of sense of wanting to position the gaze outside of those figures, but constantly this kind of moment where there's this kind of, you know, alongsideness. I mean, I think that's what really interests me about it, is that it's and I think it's an effect of the literary. I think it's something that the literary makes happen, that both something is known and unknown to us at the same time. And that's what happens, is that those spaces open up.
I think...
No, I was just thinking that isn't it also that Naipaul may not necessarily... I mean, I would want to question the idea that he's in control of what he means. I mean, I think that there are times when he reveals things about his attitudes about sexuality that are not clear to him, you know, and so I would say more as a kind of continuum also. His representations of heterosexuality are really weird, you know, in all of his texts, well, all of the texts I've read, you know. So I would see it as some kind of continuum rather than and something that he's not entirely, you know, as the author.
Have you read the last novel by him, Half Alive?
Yeah.
Because I think, because what you just said reminded me of Half Alive, like his struggling with sexuality and selfhood, and because at a certain point in Half Alive he says that because he goes through experiences with different bodies, so to speak, and every time he has sexual intercourse, he says that he finds another personality. Another person, not personality, sorry. He discovers another person in him, but it remains quite unresolved what he wants.
Just going back to Lawrence's question about why a gay man, Naipaul isn't the only one who I found who keeps returning to non-normative subjects. Lamming talks about lesbian women in 3 of his novels from 1950 to 1970. Paul Marshall has ambiguously placed characters in both of her novels in that period, before in The Fisher King more recently she does it more overtly. So, I mean, this is completely new work, and I don't think those two authors have the same kind of messy relish as Naipaul does, but I do seem to be finding that these marginal, minor characters you could almost not notice are being used to work through something about community inclusion, exclusion in the nationalist moment, and it's really messy, is about as far as I've got with it, but Naipaul isn't the only one doing it, I don't think.
I mean, Lamming holds them at more of a distance in the sense of, you know, who they are, whereas in a way for Naipaul there is this kind of, he could be them, they could be him.
Yeah, there's definitely with Naipaul more of a slippage between author and characters, but I think even with Lamming, I think in Season of Adventure and The Emigrants, lesbians are absolutely outside of the narrative, but in the Age and Innocence there's a slippage between the lesbian character and the nationalist figurehead, and there's a moment of physical touching where her hands touch him, and it's her hands are where she discovered her desire for another woman, where there's a slippage between those two characters, not author and characters, but between the two characters. So there are all kinds of complicated kind of slippages between, in Naipaul's case, author and character, but even in Lamming's case, between the figurehead he's trying to celebrate and this other lesbian presence. Well, I think.
Yeah.
I was just going back to, I mean, the in Gorillas, the whole thing about the sort of Jane Eyre, Roach and Jane, and you know, the Wuthering Heights, and Thorncross Grange. I mean, it seems to me that Naipaul is keen to shaft women writers at the same time, and Jane is a reporter. And that misogyny has to do with, you know, wanting to clear the decks in terms of women writers as well as, you know, other kinds of sexuality and so on. So.
It occurred to me actually, Wendy, in your piece, it's not connected, no, just going to throw it out, is that, I don't know if anybody knows Ursula Le Guin's The Left Hand of Darkness. When you were, you know, it just seems, it opens up, it's a book that opens up the possibility of genders, transgenders, people who can change their gender, it's a wonderful, it's you know, she's talked about as a children's writer, but actually it's much more. Yeah, you might like to look at it. You don't know it?
I do know it,
We
and
do.
I actually think, I'm trying to remember whether Noel Hopkinson was mentioned in an interview, whether this was actually a point of reference for this novel, because she has definitely talked about it in other interviews. Yeah, no, but it's worth looking into. I'll have to check. Yeah, thank you.
I know she's a fan version.
Yeah, but not with, I'm not sure, but obviously it's an important context for writing anyways, yeah.
It's interesting to think that I mean, we were talking about that earlier, that Hopkinson really still isn't a very widely discussed writer. And I wonder if that is a question of kind of people want to talk about the issues she's talking about in a very realist register, and that kind of insistence and the difficulty that she presents, because, you know, there is just so much that's called upon when you read her work.
Yeah.
And I just wonder, you know, that kind of the level of her ambition for her readers and where the debates are, which kind of fits in with what you're saying, that, you know, the kind of our entry points into the debates have become very kind of controlled by certain discourses, and you know, whether you're both arguing really for us to kind of step back and think about where we can enter those debates.
Well, this is where I would see her as a kind of, in the line of Wilson Harris, actually picking up, and, you know, an earlier generation of writers who were interested in addressing world literature, but she's changing kind of, it fits with a kind of more contemporary approach to world literature, focusing on problems of translatability, and that she is constantly invoking multiple reference points and figures that can be interpreted from different cultural perspectives, and asking the reader to do just that. So she creates these sites of translatability problems, which are then immediately tied into the problem of how to read the queer, how to read the ecological, or how to read resistance. And to me, this is what's fascinating, in addition to the experimental poetics, is the way she's negotiating it. But I think it fits exactly with your argument about the need to focus on kind of intimate moments of creolization, which are perhaps so evident, and maybe not even, you know, they're an extension of Caribbean creolization out into a kind of world, a wider world set of references.
But I think also in her work, Nala Hopkinson, I mean, that she asks you to read sometimes uncomfortably, because sometimes the writing reads like very like Pulp Fiction, at least to my mind, so that you're kind of forced, you know, to rethink your.
Which it's part of that sort of democratic, I mean, it's what Junot Diaz is doing as well, mixing high and low genres to challenge the idea of, you know, what constitutes kind of a proper literary text, or a normative literary text.
Yeah, and I was surprised myself at how uncomfortable I felt. This is pornography. This is just cheap writing, you know. And then you read it against the next bit, and it means differently. So it's kind of teaching you to read her, which is very interesting.
And I guess the difference would be that for someone like Hopkinson, she's kind of reskilling us in a way. If we learn how to read her, you know, I think she does reskill us. But the writers that you were talking about, in a sense, we need to go back to them, and there's always more effort involved in actually going back, you know.
Yeah, I agree.
And it's hard to. I
without it being a kind of retrieval in a kind of, you know, filling a gap in a very predictable kind of way. Because when you fill a gap, you're kind of filling a gap in relation to the structure you already have. So, whereas I think some of these writers, maybe not my Paul, but ask us to reconceptualize, kind of step out of the framework, to imagine beyond the familiar ways we talk about things. So.
Other questions or comments?
I was just wondering how perhaps Kate in particular might have responded to Denise's call for a sort of rethinking in terms of the categories of queer and creolization. I wondered if that had made you sort of want to perhaps, if you'd had more time, if you'd wanted to perhaps to add an addendum to your discussion of Naipaul, or not?
This is very much what I'm trying to think through at the moment, and this is what I was trying to say at the beginning, and that I'm doing the work of writing the chapters, but I'm still trying to think through where I situate myself theoretically with some of these discussions. Because on the one hand, lots of the stuff that I am finding in this period does fit very neatly and easily with the language and register of queer studies, but equally, exactly as Denise is saying, there isn't a coherent identity or desire for a coherent out-sexual identity that the language of queer works with at all. I'm not sure if I'm versed enough in theories of creolization to say whether I think creolization fits, but I certainly do have questions as to the extent to which queer is either appropriate or fits with particularly the time period I'm looking at.
That would seem to be the debate Alison and Denise should get into.
Yeah, we do.
But I was also, I mean, perhaps to ask Denise, the sort of the notion of a kind of queer or Creole temporality, knowing Wilson Harris. It bothers me.
Okay.
Because I suppose I do want to fit things into a particular historical context, and to say, you know, for instance, okay, I can understand why this kind of rhetoric was being used at this point, and why it changes at this point, and so on. So I maybe you could say more about how a Creole temporality would work.
Okay, I'm not really sure how it would work. And I suppose I would want to say it's a creolizing. I want to keep it like an active thing, rather than either a destination, which creolization suggests, or, you know, so it's a kind of mobile, dynamic thing. I completely understand the idea that you need history. You know, we need to know all those things. Those things are important. But I suppose I'm saying that it's also useful to take liberties with history, to kind of not be trapped by it. Because I think scholarship in the Caribbean for a long time has been trapped by that history of who came first, how many, who has the biggest claim, and it's kind of conceptually, imaginatively very limited. So I'm not anti-historical detail and so on, but always that history comes from somewhere. You know, history is not clean. You know, historical narratives, etc., are not clean. So I suppose it's wanting to be a bit more promiscuous with history, you know, so that Glaive story that you talked about so well, I think is really taking a big liberty by suggesting that the Black Atlantic can be inhabited by, you know, this very ambiguous figure. I think it's such a liberty to take with history, and I really like that. Or, you know, like Nalo Hopkinson, the way she just throws all kinds of historical contexts together, I think, in a way that's very irreverent. But
well, I think they're doing the two things at the same time,
yeah,
right?
Yeah.
They're interrogating and critiquing the material conditions of history at the same time that they're revisioning, restructuring, and kind of trying to disclose new possibilities and imaginaries, and particularly, I think, the point we touched on by kind of, in fact, creating new kinds of readers and new kinds of communities. In order to read the text properly, you need to learn a lot, and you need to move beyond your own horizon, and that they do all of, the texts do all of this at once seems to me the important thing.
Yeah, because also then you're kind of limited by what history there is. So one of the things that I haven't had time to work on is what it might mean to bring Amerindian culture, for one, Amerindian, terrible word, but to bring that into the debate about creolization. Because that's just seemed like, I've never seen anything anywhere where that kind of cultural impact is registered or felt, or, you know, I know we can all name the odd references and the odd writer and so on, but not in any kind of substantial way. So I think we then have to sort of step into more from the imaginative to make up for that. But I'm not anti-history.
And I guess what I would say, Lawrence, in my kind of, you know, using that term queer is absolutely kind of to use it strategically as a provocation, to say that, you know, this is the word that people think can never go alongside Caribbeanness. But actually, as well as it looks like a complete paradox, it's also there's a logic to using that word, because we think of the Caribbean completely as a culture queer space, and yet we think it's a culture queer space in which sexual queerness, you know, can never find place. So it's just, I mean, it's not, and I fret because I hear Denise saying, you know, grandstanding and queerism and all of that, and I worry about that because it's true. You know, it's true that you make that bold thing, but in a way, what I hope the readings do are to be quite quiet and nuanced and look at the fact that there isn't any incompatibility between the insistence on not being regulated by sexual norms and the kind of sense in which that is a Caribbean inheritance, this particular kind of historical inheritance. But I just use that term deliberately to kind of amplify, because I think the danger of us not using terms, and because the writers are so ingenious, they don't need to use those words. I'm stuck with terms that I'm not happy with, but I'm worried that if I don't use them at all, the critical silence or the subtlety of critique might just allow the argument, the kind of force for sexual politics that I'm trying to say. So I guess I use it deliberately as an amplifier and a provocation. But it's not necessarily a term that I think does the best work. I actually think that Denise's work is better than mine in that respect. I want to use it as a tactic to see what might be made possible by putting these two things that seem to be, you know, in a state of friction, and showing how in the literary, I think that there is, you know, there's the most wonderful lubrication between the two.
Lubrication.
There we go. Oh God, sorry. Getting a bit carry on now.
But I think you can use queer. I think you can use queer and creolizing simultaneously. You know, they don't have to cancel each other out. I suppose there's part of me that feels this like, well, no, it's quite a large part. That is a kind of resistance to the kind of everything being generated from, you know, a certain from the West, you know, from the American Academy. There is a kind of resistance that because our situations are different, you know, so it's not to it's the ambition of it is also so wide that I think and nationalism, regionalism still has a kind of valency necessarily in the Caribbean that is not the case for American academics, have a particular kind of relationship, quite rightly, to nationalism within North America. So it's just such different contexts that I think.
But I think what's great is that all of us are doing this kind, and we're all, you know, trying to kind of, you know, work on that problem and kind of rub at the kind of barriers in different ways and thin them, and likewise, you know, Kieran's doing it from a different perspective, you know, Lawrence, Bernadine again from a different perspective, and hopefully that kind of, you know, multi-pincer approach will mean that eventually, you know, some shift some slippage will begin, you know, and I think, you know, it's really interesting to see a very different methodology and a very different research methods, kind of in a way very congruent with all of our thinking, you know, in terms of what the more people can touch and be touched by each other, you know, the less possible it is to hold that hostility, and the way in which all of us are really talking about critical modes of finding that, literary modes of finding that, just kind of, you know, being able to make visible what we see as already a possible reciprocity, you know, even between the situation you're talking about, the old free, that's never free, evacuated or uncontaminated, you know. But even in the ways it's flawed is kind of interesting and possible as well. Does that make sense?
Yes, I'm not unhappy. Not forget the data.
Yeah, the data's fascinating. Yeah.
Well, is it fair to ask you a question now, Kiel?
If no one minds to answer from here.
Because I was thinking about, it was you just now talking about, you know, different ways of touching each other and, you know, imagining beyond your own situation. And when you were talking about the study about people imagining what it might be like to, you know, to have contact with a gay person, I wondered, like, how was that presented to them? Like, were they given, supposing that, you know, if all they have is a stereotype, then what, you know?
It was actually left very much open. So
Right.
we asked them to imagine an interaction, and we gave them 3 adjectives: comfortable, relaxed, and positive. That's
Right. Okay.
And that was enough to guide it to be a good enough interaction.
Okay.
That doesn't work all the time. So in other
Right.
things, I've done the same thing to improve attitudes towards people with schizophrenia, and that's not apparently sufficient all the time. People
Right.
imagine some really terrible things in those cases, and that makes things worse instead of better. But it is, I mean, there's a good argument to be made that you should direct people to imagine specific things. But there's another good argument to be made that what people find positive or happy differs from person to person, and that they're imagining something positive would be the most important part.
Like, what you ask is, where would that positive come from, given that all the
Right.
negatives, like the newspaper and everything?
Yeah.
It's a very
because-
good question. I mean, I guess in general, and this could be why the effect in the Jamaican example was not very big. And what we could have done is we could have kept all the writings and read them through and then figured out what it is that people were imagining. But I suppose that what it shows is that we are capable of imagining some good interaction. So I guess if we go to the other example, you could imagine a positive interaction with a rampant homophobe. That is possible. It's not something you do on a regular basis, but if you were to really try it now, you just sit down, you could talk about something that didn't have anything to do with sexuality. You could have a nice tea, I guess. You could, whatever makes you happy. But it's possible to imagine that interaction. And I guess for them, our participants, it just must have been possible for them to imagine it without that context there, or maybe circumventing the context in some way. But it's a very good question. I have no idea what they imagined, and it's probably the kind of thing we should have looked at to figure out how they were doing it.
Okay, well, thank you, everybody. We've got a tiny bit of time now before we eat again. So just relax a bit, and I think food's in the same place again, is it? We're going to reconvene at 6, was it 5:30 actually? So not so much time for the readings. So thank you to all our speakers.